We had learned last week the Masechet Sotah, the tractate Sotah, volume Daf Mem Gimel Amud Aleph, folio 43a, about the speech. The speech that we've learned about earlier, that the Kohen recites when he comes. We learned about how, just refreshing memory really quickly, that when you go to war, that the Kohen makes a speech. It says that first of all, as you see everything, you shouldn't be afraid, etc., etc. Let's see where it says Kohen. Otherwise, the Nigasha Kohen, and the Kohen comes forth. The Kohen comes forth and addresses the troops. The Amar Alehem, and he says X, Y, Z. And then it says V'dibru hashotrim, and then the officials come, and they shall address the troops. It means officials, could be generals, and they say, is anybody here who just really built the house, or just planted a vineyard, or just got engaged, and then v'yasvu hashotrim, and then the official shall go on further, and shall say, whoever's afraid should go back and not demoralize everybody else. Okay. So we had gone through that, and now we were going through, let's see, we have a few more people here, just and then we were going through the Gemara telling us, looking into the text more and more. So let's go back to where we were and just bring this person in, and that takes care of everybody there. And okay, so we learned last week in paragraphs 4, 5, and 6 that it applies not only to a person who has built a house, that he is exempt and could go back, but even someone who has built a woodshed or a stable for horses or for cows, or what did they have? Did some other things, that storehouse for straw, any of those also are exempt. And we said these exemptions are for voluntary wars, Melchemet Reshut, as opposed to wars that are in active defense of the homeland, where the land has been invaded. Then there's no exemptions, then everybody has to fight. Okay. And we also said that if someone received, not only if he built less than a house, but just a woodshed or a storage for straw, or those different things we said, not only that, but if a person simply, it doesn't matter whether he built it or whether he bought it, whether he even just inherited it or got it as a gift. He does not fight. He goes back and enjoys this new property. All right. And then we said also last week about the one who planted a vineyard. He goes home to enjoy his grapes for the first year. And likewise, it went even beyond that. Someone who has planted 5 different trees, fruit trees, also was exempt for the year. And it doesn't have to be 5 of the same tree, but it could be same fruit, but it could be 5 different kinds of fruit, as long as they are biblical fruit. And we went through the pasuk in Deuteronomy, Devarim Perek Chet, chapter 8, verse 8, Perek Chet, pasuk Chet, where it lists the fruits and grain of Israel that God told Moshe to promise the nation. When you arrive in a promised land, you will find wheat and barley, and you will find these things, and you'll find figs and pomegranates and dates and olives and grapes. So those 5, if a person planted 5 of one, or 1 each of 5 or whatever, they're off for a year. But if they only planted 4, they still have to fight. And if they're planting sycamore trees and elm trees and oak trees, they still have to fight. Only fruit trees gained the exemption in a Melchemet Reshut, an optional war. And then he said, furthermore, this applies whether the person, this exemption applies whether he literally planted the whole thing, or whether he participated in the process of growing it. Even in the case of someone who grafted different trees into one another. That also. And then I threw out as an aside that I would be discussing tonight, which I will, God willing, that unspoken here is, what do you mean? I thought grafting is not allowed under the Torah. And we'll get to that in a moment. Let's see where that's going to go. Yeah. So if someone planted a vineyard or just grafted one into another or layers the vine, bending the branch into the ground so it may take root and all that. And likewise, if he inherited or he was given it as a gift, yada, yada. So we'll take a moment on the grafting and then we'll go to the third type. But we didn't do this last week, this part. Here we go. Torah says in Vayikra, Leviticus chapter 19, Parak Yotet. This is the famous chapter for many reasons. You should not take revenge. You should not bear a grudge against members of your people. Love your fellow as yourself. Love your neighbor as yourself. The golden rule, Ahavta l'reacha kamocha. And then right afterwards, Et chukotai tishmoru behem techalo tarbia kilayim sod chalo tizra kilayim uveged kilayim shaatnez lo ya'aleh alecha. It's a bit of a strange law. The rabbis talk about why and this idea of whether we're going to say grafting or you're not supposed to mix certain natural things together. It's a halacha. Why? We don't really know. It's kind of like a chok. There are three kinds of laws, basically. There are mishpatim, judgments, and there's like laws, like on the books, that have reasons. And chokim are laws that it's translated typically English into statute. Whenever they translate words like chokim, mishpatim, they normally refer to as chokim as statutes. But more properly, it's a multi-worded definition. A chok is a law that has no discernible reason. We can't figure it out. We were just talking on Sunday about the red heifer, Pora Aduma, that a red heifer is taken and it's burned and its ashes are mixed with water, and people who've come into contact with the deceased and have tumat met have become ritually impure through contact with the deceased, or have been in a building with someone who under the same roof is deceased, like in a hospital. It's a whole thing with morgues in a hospital and someone who's been to a cemetery to visit a relative. So the place is full of people who've died, and we come away from that tumat met, tame met. We're impurified. And in biblical times, you were in a state of biblical impurification until you took some of the red heifer ashes mixed with the holy water, and that could purify you, and was a necessity in order to participate in Pesach with a paschal lamb, the Korban Pesach. You were not allowed to have a part in the Pesach service if you were impure. It's a whole thing in the Torah about some people who Pesach suddenly came, and suddenly last minute they came into contact with someone dead, and suddenly it was like no time to go to the red heifer to get some of that. And what are they going to do? And that was the part in the Torah that talks about Pesach Sheni, that for emergency like that, they're supposed to do an equivalent to a Pesach the following month, an ER on the same day in the month. But that's not like just for any old person who has a quasi-emergency. That's only for people who run into like last minute encountering the dead, suddenly at a cemetery, whatever. So, excuse me. So in the same way, what we have here is there are certain chukim, laws that have no discernible reason. What is it about a red heifer that a different heifer would not be good? But why does it have to be a heifer? A cow that never gave birth to any child, any calf. Why does it have to be a heifer? And why does it have to be? And how does that purify? And there's like a lot of questions. I can go on and on. The whole chapter just full of secondary and tertiary sub-rules and sub-rules, all of which are curious. That's a chok. We don't know why. It's just God's law. So in the same way, God made laws. We're not allowed to mix certain natural things together. And it doesn't say why. And there are theories. Rabbis offer maybe this, maybe that. But the honest truth is we don't know why. So let's take a look at what it is, and it brings us back to grafting, which is forbidden in and of itself. Let's take a look back. Here we go. In Devarim, in chapter 19 of the book of Deuteronomy, Perek Yotet of Sefer Devarim, so it says, you're not allowed to, okay, we did that. You shall observe my laws. And they use the word chok, chukotai. Chok is a singular statute. Chukot is plural. Chukotai are my statutes. You shall observe my statutes. You shall not let your cattle mate with a different kind. So that's an example. You can't have one kind of animal, one kind of cow with another kind of cow to reproduce. You shall not sow your field with two kinds of seed. If your field is, I don't know, it's wheat, then it's wheat. And if it's barley, and whatever. You're not allowed to mix it to try to create a new kind of crop. Not allowed to engage in that kind of agricultural scientific work. But I also mentioned last class, and we won't go into the deeper detail of it, if someone else has done it, it's a rare case where if someone else has done it, you are allowed to benefit from it. So we are allowed to eat nectarines, which is a mix of plum and peach, I think. So you're not allowed to take a plum tree and a peach tree and graft them together to create nectarines. But if someone else did it and sells nectarines, you're allowed to have it, which is a little bit unusual. Like if somebody is not allowed to drive on Shabbat and transact commerce on Shabbat. So you invite somebody for Friday night Shabbat dinner, and they're not Orthodox. So they don't play by those rules, and you know that, but you want them to be with you on Shabbat. Never know what that could lead to. So you invite someone to come on Shabbat, and the person shows up with a bottle of wine, right? That's pretty universal for people show up. First time they come, they bring flowers, they bring chocolate, and then eventually they just bring wine. In fact, if they come often, they just do a shipment of like a dozen wines from Trader Joe's, and they bring another bottle each time. And so the question arises, if they bought that bottle on Shabbat on the way to your house, you're not allowed to have that wine if they're Jewish, particularly, because you're benefiting from their sin. So you're not allowed to do that. And it gets it's touchy. And you have to be ready for a basic excuse that, well, we already had this bottle open and we'll have yours next time, which you won't. You'll wait till your friend, you have perhaps a Chinese American friend who lives out of town and visits you once a year. And every year you give him about 24 bottles of wine. And by the 9th year he's visited, he knows he's collecting all the Shabbat wines. And the paradox, of course, is he can bring a bottle of wine because he's not Jewish, so he can transact on Shabbat. As long as the bottle is kosher, and since he's not Jewish, that's B'yayin Muvushal, which is another subject we don't have time for. Okay. So that's a case where if a Jewish person breaks the law, you're not allowed to benefit from his or her breaking the law. Should not insult him. There's an episode of Srugim, a program Denise and I were just mentioning it, remembering it the other day, namely today. Srugim is a most wonderful, wonderful, wonderful 3-year series, episodic series you can get on Amazon. It was they did it about 10, 15 years ago in Israel. It's as fresh today as it was 10, 15 years ago. And it's just a wonderful, kind of like somewhere between Seinfeld and Friends, a little bit more serious, but still a lot of tongue-in-cheek about modern Orthodox Jews. It centers around 5 modern Orthodox Jews living in Jerusalem in Katamon, the Katamon neighborhood, which is like a very expensive neighborhood. And there are 5 singles who are like sharing 2 apartments or whatever, and they get together very frequently over Friday night dinner, over Shabbat dinner. And it's just the most wonderful, wonderful show. If you're into the culture, especially, even if you're non-Jewish, And even if you're Jewish and you don't know from Orthodoxy, it's still a really good show. But if you know a little bit, it's a great show. Srugim, Srugim. Srug means woven. Kippah sruga is a woven knitted yarmulke. And these are knitted yarmulke Jews, modern Orthodox. So why am I talking about that? Because there's an episode there where that actually happens, that one of the 5 of them who had been Orthodox becomes non-Orthodox. They're all in their mid-20s, early 30s. And she has gotten emotionally involved with a non-religious professor. And she's moved away. She's gone off the derech, OTD. But she's still part of the group. They love her. She loves them. And they still invite her every Friday night for Shabbat dinner. And she comes, but now that she's not religious anymore, she buys the wine on the way on Shabbat. And there's like a whole, how they try to avoid drinking from that bottle of wine. It's TV, but if you know the culture, you understand what's going on. And so normally you're not allowed to benefit from some Jewish person breaking Shabbat. If you're not allowed to turn on the light on Shabbat, but you have a non-religious person coming over the house, you can't say, well, this one's coming, Bernie Sanders is coming for dinner tonight, so let's ask him to put his pork down on the floor and turn on the light for us. You can't. You can't benefit from a Jew. Even Bernie Sanders or Trotsky, same thing. And interestingly, therefore, if a person grafts, the halacha is you're allowed to benefit from the nectarine and stuff like that. Let's go back. We're always using the opportunity to learn more halacha than meets the eye. So let's continue. We try to graft one halacha onto another halacha. So you're not supposed to mate the cattle with different kinds. Not allowed to plant, like scientifically try to create a new variation of a grain or fruit by grafting. And you shall not put on clothing that is a mixture of 2 kinds of material, particularly shaatnez, particularly wool and linen. You're not allowed to wear a garment that has linen and wool. That's called shaatnez. In Yiddish, it's pronounced shaatnez. If you're more careful, it's shaatnez. Shaatnez. We see this in Leviticus 19, Perek Yutet of Sefer Vayikra, and we see it also in Perek Chavbet, chapter 22 of Devarim, Deuteronomy. This is, we read some of the other interesting laws, which we're not going to go into, but interesting laws, like you're required to build a fence around your roof. If you have a flat roof, you must build a fence around it to prevent anyone from falling. Well, no one ever goes on my roof, and you still have to build a fence. Well, I'm careful, you still have to build a fence. If it's kind of slanty roofs that people don't go on except for a roofer, then the halacha doesn't apply. But like a square kind of roof, you got to build a fence. When you build a new house, you shall make a parapet, ma'akeh, for your roof, so that you do not bring blood guilt. Lo tasim damim b'veitecha. You don't bring blood in your house. That God forbid, ki pol hanofel mimenu, that someone will fall. All right, and it goes right into here. Lo tizra karmacha kilayim. You shall not sow your vineyard. Previously in Leviticus 19, it said the field, like grain. You might think it refers only to grain growing from the ground or fruit growing from a classic tree. So even from vines, you shall not sow your vineyard with a second kind of seed. Pen tikta sham leah hazera asher tizra utevuat akaram. You're not allowed to do that. Else the crop from the seed you have sown and the yield of that vineyard may not be used. So And then you're not allowed to plow with an ox and an ass together, two beasts of burden, but you're not allowed to yoke them together to pull your tractor or whatever it is, or your whatever it is they do. I'm not always good with these words. I want to thank several of you. Last week, I was trying to think of what do you call a group of cows, and I remembered that there's a flock of sheep and there's a murder of crows, and I couldn't remember, and a gaggle of geese. I couldn't remember cows, and several of you brought to my attention the term is herd, H-E-R-D, herd of cows. Of course, a herd of cows. And you shall not plow an ox and ass together. And here we have shaatnez again. And here they spell it out more carefully. Lo tilbash shaatnez semru fishtim yachdav. You shall not wear cloth combining wool and linen. How strict is that? When you go, particularly in a place like New York, or in any kind of Orthodox community, parts of Florida, parts of Los Angeles, Pico Robertson, there's like a store, there's like a guy in every one of these cities who's a full-time shaatnez checker. And you buy a suit or a dress, and you bring it to the shaatnez guy. And he tells you to come back in a week. And he checks for shaatnez. How's he going to check? What's he going to do? How is he going to check this jacket, whether it has linen and wool in it? So it's understood the guy can't go around cutting up the whole jacket and then sewing the whole thing back. It'll look like a circus clown. And you just spent good money on a nice suit, or even not. What they do is they cut inside the thingy, the collar on the inside. They check like the felt, and they check the stuffing underneath. And based on that, they also check like the lining, inside the lining. And I can tell you from how many decades of being a customer, you never could, it's not like, oh my gosh, you just spent this much money on a suit or a jacket, and oh my gosh, you'll never, I'm telling you, you don't know. You would never know where he cut it. It would be like when you go to the dry cleaner, and you kind of wonder, did they actually do anything? They're asking you for $30. You know, they have a plastic, they put a plastic bag on it, and they stuff some paper into it, and they tell you that'll be $30. And you really don't know. Are you paying $30 for the plastic bag and the paper, or did they actually clean it? So when you bring it to a dry cleaner. So in the same way, you bring it to the shaatnez guy. And I attended, we did my when I was at Beth Jacob, I brought in a shaatnez expert, and he gave, because we don't have like shaatnez testing in Irvine. So, and he taught us how to be shaatnez testers. And we ran a class for like 3 weeks. And all of us, we had to sign up. We all had to buy a microscope, literally a microscope, like they do in high school biology, and other materials. There were a lot of materials. It was an expensive course. And the guy taught us. It was really quite, I had no idea that when you cut open the garment and you start, it turns out that silk has a certain pattern under the microscope, and wool has its pattern, and linen has its pattern, and even the fake stuff, rayon, dacron or dacron, polyester, they all have, you could tell polyester under the microscope from rayon. Heck of a thing. Because the question becomes, all right, now you cut up the guy's suit, and you pulled out the stuffing. How do you know if it's wool or linen? I mean, obviously, they refined the wool. It's not like it's off the sheep's body. It's nice and refined and smooth. How can you tell what's what? And he showed us. None of us ended up going into shaatnez testing. Far too much, far too complicated. And I know I don't want to take the responsibility to take a guy's $900, $3,000 suit and sew it back like the scarecrow in the Wizard of Oz. So in the end, none of us did it, but we all got quite an education. And part of the education was you go to the shaatnez guy when you need it done. So shaatnez is a serious thing. Like, you don't buy woolen, you don't wear wool and flax linen together. And you're supposed to look at the label. When you go shopping, you look at the label and it might say all wool, you still bring it to the shaatnez guy. Just like in food, it'll say all this or all that, and then there's some small amount that there's in there that the Food and Drug Administration or the Federal Trade Commission allows if it's a small little amount. So you go to the shaatnez guy. But if the thing says, I once was going to buy a suit, and it was made in Poland, I remember it's the only time in my life I ever was about to buy something, and I looked at the label, which is perfunctory because they never have wool and linen together. I don't know why. Obviously, it's not out of observing shaatnez. And son of a gun, it was like 60% wool, 40% linen. I remember, like, if I had a picture, a camera, I'm not a camera picture guy, but that one it's like the first time I found, like, literally. One more thing about shaatnez, I still remember. There was a store, I don't know if it's still there, it was like 50 years ago, called the Mail Shop, M-A-L-E, the Mail Shop in Brooklyn on Flatlands Avenue near Canarsie. That's where that's where my mother bought stuff for me, my suits and stuff when I was a boy. And I grew up in college. Instead of buying a suit near college, I always had bought at the Mail Shop. So I used to go home every Friday to spend Shabbos with my mom and my three sisters, because I was the oldest. So when my father had passed away, I would recite Kiddush, and I felt a responsibility to be home every Shabbat to recite Kiddush and Havdalah and the things that a guy does. Just like the woman lights Shabbos candles, there's certain things the guy does, and if there is no guy, then the woman recites Kiddush and everything. But my sisters, it was very important. They were all younger, and I played an important role. So anyway, I came home every Shabbos, and it was like 90 minutes on the IRT and the BMT, the subways of New York, and they were dangerous then too. And when I needed a suit, I came home earlier that Friday to go to the Mail Shop. And I still remember they had a new guy. This was like an Orthodox neighborhood, modern Orthodox. This wasn't like Black Hat Haredi, but this was a heavily Orthodox community. And a big thing in their radio advertising, we do shaatnez testing. Can you imagine that? Regular radio, not like a Jewish station. Regular radio, go to the Mail Shop, great suits, great prices, straight from Italy, you'll buy, for one suit, we'll give you 95 suits, 600 pairs of shirts, 2 socks, and 18 ties, the whole thing, and free shaatnez testing. So anyway, I go there, and I guess I got a new salesman, didn't know the shtick. And so I said to him, just want to make sure, you do shaatnez testing? 100%. And he says to me, and I want to assure you, he saw my yarmulke, he says, I want to assure you, everything we sell is certified 100% shaatnez. You can count on the Mail Shop. If you want shaatnez, we are the place to go. Have you heard our ads? 100% shaatnez. You're listening to this guy, Shmendrick, and no point in educating him. So anyway, it was tested and it was shaatnez free. And if it would have been, and what if it had shaatnez? Then you can't have the suit. Then they sew it back up and they tell you, unfortunately, we know you like the suit. We're refunding the money. It's a mistake because we advertised that all our stuff is shaatnez free, and it was a mistake. So this law of mixing things is a very big halacha. Now, you are allowed to wear a wool sweater over a linen shirt, but it can't be in the same fabric, in the same thingy. Likewise, over a linen blouse or whatever. Back to our Gemara. So what we're seeing is something about grafting. You're not allowed to do grafting. And yet they're saying that a person who has newly planted a vineyard is given an exemption for a year from the army, if it's a Mohammed Rashut, an option of war. And even if he just grafted, he's free from serving in the army. And we've just seen the Torah says black and white, you're not allowed to graft. So what's going on here? Let's find our little Gemara if we can. Let's see. There we are. So the Gemara, let's find that 43, just a moment. 43, if I lost it, I'll pull it back up. It's going to be Sota. Just give me a moment. Talmud, not Talmud, no. I'm sorry, Talmud. And then we want Sota. And then we want 43A. Okay. And then we were on 43A and stop. Okay. So we now go to 43B and they talk about it. 43B, paragraph 7, I believe. Yeah. Omarab Yirmiyah. Okay. So Rabbi Yirmiyah, in the discussion in the Gemara about halacha, and particularly this discussion, he says it had said something about that a guy who grafted is exempt for a year, but that's a sin. How could he graft? So they're trying to understand what kind of grafting are we talking about? They can't be talking about certain standard grafting. So like even the previous paragraph or two, and I won't take out the time for it. But the basic idea is that you're not allowed to graft. The Midrash perform forbidden grafting. Grafting is forbidden. So in the case of one does return from the ranks, he's performed permitted grafting. Okay. So the rabbis are troubled, and they're saying here, in the case where one does not return from the ranks, the one who is not exempt is a man who has performed forbidden grafting. But in the case where one does return from the ranks, goes back home, is exempt, he has performed permitted grafting. So Gemara says, what is permitted grafting? Rabbi Yirmiyah said, actually, one returns home, that is, he assembled for war but was given an exemption on the grounds that he recently planted a vineyard, but actually did not plant the vineyard but grafted. If he grants a young tree with another young tree, well, so far that's not allowed. And it is a case in which he planted the first one for a fence or for beams. He built it for a siag or korot, for a fence or beams, not for its fruit. So that he is exempt from battle only because of the second tree. Because merely having planted a tree for the wood that he is going to need for a fence or a beam, that's not an exemption. We said you have to plant fruit trees or a vineyard. 5 fruit trees of one type of Israel fruit, or 5 different ones, or 5 different fruits of Israel. But if he's simply planting a tree for a fence or a beam, he goes to war. He's exempt because he was grafting for the second tree, which he grafts for fruit. So, and they're learning it from a Braita, or from a Mishneh in Orla, in a case of one who plants a tree for a fence or to yield wood for beams, the tree is exempt from the law, halacha, of Orla. That's these agricultural laws. Okay, so now we go back to the Gemara that we're presently learning, 43b, and we're going to go to here we go. And so let's just finalize the 43b we were learning, the 43a we were learning. We had learned about the house, and we learned about, okay, it's just a little bit earlier than this. Here we go. Okay. So those are people who are exempt. And finally, someone who just got engaged and is not yet married. And the Gemara adds, the next verse says, and what man is there that is betrothed a wife and has not taken her for marriage? Let him go and return to his house. He is sent home if he is one who betroths a virgin, namely somebody he has not been with before, and she has not been with before, or if he is one, but that's not it, or if he is one who betroths a widow, who presumably is not a virgin, technically could be, but typically is not. And in Hebrew, certainly there's a difference of a betula, which is a virgin, and almana, which is a widow. And almana implicitly has been intimate with the husband who ultimately died. So even if he's only betrothed a widow only, and is not yet married her, he also is exempt from going to war. And we learned last week it applies even if there's a yavama, waiting for him as his yavam to perform levirate marriage. That's the one where the brother died. We learned about it last week, leaving behind a widow. And it is incumbent on the surviving brother to marry his sister-in-law, the widow, as long as they have not previously had children. And the child that will come from that intimacy between the living brother and the widow of the deceased brother will be deemed as though having been the child of the deceased. It's like it's preserving the deceased's legacy. And that's called Yibum, Y-I-B-U-M. Yibum, it's a Hebrew word, of course. She is called a Yavama, and he's the Avam. And we also mentioned last week that there's also a release button here, that if for some reason he can't marry her, either because he's already married to someone else in there, they allow polygamy in biblical times. Yaakov Avinu, our father Jacob, was married both to Rachel and Leah's sisters, Rachel and Leah, and indeed also took on each of their maidservants. So ended up with also Bilhah and Zilpah, who themselves gave birth to tribes of Israel. Bilhah gave us Dan and Naphtali, and Zilpah gave us Gad and Asher, etc., etc. But if a man now is a Yavam who has a Yavama waiting for him, and he's married, and his wife will not let him do it, she's just not going to allow it, and he makes this analysis and decides better not get involved with this, or he really finds that lady not acceptable to him, or historically, when he was married, they just did not get along. The brother-in-law and the sister-in-law hated each other, for whatever reason. He just can't do it. So there's chalitza, by which the woman I mentioned last time puts on a shoe, unbuckles it, spits on the ground, and recites a particular biblical recital that shame and curse on a man who refuses to raise up a child to extend the legacy of his deceased brother. Okay, so when it says that a man who's engaged, has not yet married, goes back from the army, that even applies to a man who's engaged to a widow and has not yet married, and it even applies to a man whose widowed sister-in-law is awaiting him to take her as a Yavama or to reject. But it hasn't been finalized yet, so he also does not go to war, because he is regarded as someone engaged, ready to marry. Because what is engagement in Judaism? A contract that has been done that removes the last obstacle to marrying. So in secular life, you could get married without being engaged. Engagement is like a promise, and it's romantic, and it's a commitment. And now we need time to get a hotel and a waiter and a caterer and get out the invitations. But in halacha, an engagement actually is a contract that says you, the woman, may not have any relationship whatsoever, even though we're not married yet, with any other man. You're forbidden to any man now. If you would engage in physical intimacy now that we're mi'uras, engaged, that's adultery. That's punishable by death for the adulterer and the adulteress. So that's like already a thing. That's not just some romantic thing where we're engaged. So in the same way, Yavama is like an engagement, a halachic engagement. The last obstacle to marrying her is out of the way. And now she's not allowed to fool with anybody else. He's going to marry her. And unless there's chalitza, which then terminates that contract, so to speak. So what we're learning here is that the Torah says what the Torah says. That's the written law. And beyond that, there's the oral law that carries within it a great deal more. Let's continue. So those are the people who assemble to the battlefield to go to war, and they hear the speeches by the Kohen, HaMashiach, the anointed Cohen, and the generals, and they basically are told to go back home. Okay. We continue. Ve'elu she'enan chosrin, and the following, who also are assembled among the army, and hear that speech, and wonder, maybe that applies to me too? No. The following do not go back and are not exempt, even though their status is a little bit like what's being talked about. These are the men who do not return. One who builds a gateway or an enclosed veranda or a balcony. So even though the building of a woodshed or a storehouse for straw or a stable for cows gets you an exemption, but you build a patio or a balcony, it doesn't go that far. Or one who plants no more than 4 fruit trees. So while it doesn't literally limit itself exclusively to someone who planted a vineyard, but it also applies to someone who planted 5 fruit trees, as long as it's fruit of the Torah listed fruits of Israel, as opposed to, let's say, an orange tree, an apple tree. But if you planted 4 fruit trees and you figure, well, that's pretty much more than half, that's good. No, it's not good enough. You still go to the army. Or even 5 or more non-fruit trees. You did oak and a pine and I don't know, an elm and a sycamore and another sycamore more. They're not fruit bearing, so you're still in the army. Or you built 4. Or one who remarries his divorced wife. So if you're marrying a widow, not only a new wife who's never been married before, but a widow, you are exempt. But if it's like Richard Burton and Elizabeth Taylor, where they get divorced, they marry on Monday, get divorced on Tuesday, remarry on Wednesday, remarrying a divorced wife, your own divorced wife, you are not exempt. And that's based on the following verse. Let's see if I can pull it up. Yeah, let's see, is it this one? Let's see. Yeah, because it says in Deuteronomy 20, which is the foundation of what we've been studying, Umi ha'ish asher erasi sha velo lekacha, who is the man who got engaged to a woman and did not take her? All right, so far. And now beyond that, Deuteronomy, I think it's here. See if I got the right verse, and if I don't, I don't. I'll look for it. It's in the Midrash, Sifri. So otherwise, it's just fine. Okay. It says in Devarim 24:5. In Deuteronomy 24, Ki kach ish isha charasha. If a man takes, this is not Deuteronomy 20. This is 4 chapters later. In Deuteronomy 24, it says, Ki yikach ish isha charasha. If a man takes a woman who is new, chadash is new, male, chadasha, female, lo yetzei batzava, he shall not go out to war, v'lo ya'avor alav l'chol davar, and he shall not be engaged in anything to do with the military, l'chol davar, for anything, even to provide water, to provide food, to pave roads for the chariots and horses and footmen, foot soldiers. For he's not allowed to have anything whatsoever. Naki yeleveto shana echad. He is completely exempt, clean. Naki literally means clean. He's clean of obligation. He should be yihiyah. He should be leveto habayit shalo, his house, shana echad, 1 year. V'simach et ishto, sameach is happy. He should gladden his wife, asher lakach, whom he has taken. So the rabbis pick up on the word chadasha. Ki ikach isha chadasha. If a man takes a new wife, they learn from this a brand new wife, of course. And if he's taking on a widow who might not be newly marrying, she may have married before, but to him, she is new, he's exempt. But if he's remarrying his former wife whom he divorced, she's not chadasha. for him, she's not new. So therefore, marrying her does not get him an exemption. Okay. So continuing. It says these are the ones who don't return. As far as building, we just said a balcony is not enough. As far as trees, we just said 4 trees or 5 not or more non-fruit or fruit trees that are not Israel fruit trees. And now as far as remarrying a divorced wife. So with regard to a widow betrothed to so a forbidden marriage does not get you out of the army. Who's not allowed? What's a forbidden marriage? Obviously, marrying a non-Jew is forbidden. But beyond that, and we're always talking a man with a wife because women do not serve in a Torah army. Okay. So with regard to a widow betrothed to a high priest, a Kohen Gadol. So that's interesting. A Kohen is not allowed to marry a divorcee, and a Kohen is not allowed to marry a convert. A Kohen only may marry a widow or a virgin. A high Kohen, not only there's only one in a generation, the Kohen Gadol, not only may not marry a divorcee and a convert, he's not even allowed to marry a widow. Okay. And then there's the idea, it's going to come up in a moment, of a mamzer, just to refresh your memory. A mamzer, someone who halachically is a bastard in the legal sense of the term, namely born to a woman who became impregnated through adultery. And again, it's equal gender, the sin. The woman who committed adultery and the man who committed the adultery with her. So, and we're not going to get too much. That's a whole parsha of Sota, which is actually the Talmud we're learning. But that's a whole story, all those laws, not for tonight. But a woman's not allowed, if she's married, not allowed to engage in physical intimacy with, forget about, not with a non-Jew, not even with a legitimate Jew, if she's married to some other guy. And so that's not allowed. And then her child, a mamzer, or mamzeret, a male or female mamzer, born of adultery, is not allowed to marry into the Jewish people directly, forever, for the whole lifetime. So they can't marry a Jew? They are a Jew. They're 150,000% Jew. Go to yeshiva, they go to yeshiva, they could become rabbis. But they can't marry into the Jewish people. Because so what's going to be? They may marry either another mamzer. Well, how many are there? In a generation where there's one, there's usually more than one. Leave it at that. Just look outside your front door. And then number 2, they're allowed to marry converts. And there are a fair number of converts. And a shaatnez, someone who's a matchmaker, when they first interview someone who's interested, who comes to them and says, I'd like your help, and that the shaatnez will ask, are you a Kohen? Well, if it's a man, and they will ask, are you divorced? Are you widowed? Are you a mamzer, mamzeret? And in the context of that discussion, it's a very acceptable question to ask. I've been in that situation. As a rabbi, I had a Kohen in Florida. I had a rabbi in Florida reached out to me, telling me that he has a guy in his shul who's Kohen looking to marry. I had someone for him. I don't know if it would have worked, but I had one idea, and I called her, and she knew me. I knew her, and she was Orthodox, so she knew where I'm coming from. And I asked her whether she's allowed to marry. I don't think I said, are you a mamzer, are you a bastard? I think I said, look, you're Orthodox, are you allowed to marry a Kohen? Because I knew she had never married. So she knew and I knew. And she said to me, no, I'm not allowed to marry a Kohen. Because when I was younger, I wasn't Orthodox and I was in college and I'm not allowed to marry a Kohen. So it's the thing. So this is tied in with today's Gemara. Here we go. Not only today's Gemara, the instant Gemara we're learning right now. So when it comes to women, which ones get you exempt from military service in a optional war, a milchemet reshut? Okay, with regard to a widow betrothed to a Kohen Gadol, that doesn't get you off. That the Kohen Gadol still has to go serve, I guess. A divorcee or yavama who performed chalitza in lieu of entering into a Levirate marriage, betrothed to a common Kohen. That's a long way of saying, if a Kohen, a regular Kohen, not a Kohen Gadol, got himself betrothed to a divorcee, which is forbidden, or a woman pending Yavama, a Yavama pending Yibum, which for a Kohen is forbidden, that's a forbidden marriage. I, as a rabbi, am not allowed to join them in a marriage. No, it's not an intermarriage. It's not like that, but it is a thing. I have to ask that when a couple comes to me. I have to ask them their background and the same questions. And it's not only any Orthodox rabbi. I mean, we don't make a big public thing about it because it's not romantic. And for people who are not Orthodox, they can't handle it. They can't handle it. And if you're in a big enough shul, you have enough non-Orthodox people who come to shul because they want to be in an Orthodox shul, or the same Kaddish and they want it to be an Orthodox place, or they grew up in an Orthodox place, or they just know Reform is fake and they just can't bring themselves to sit through that nonsense. So they come Shabbos to Orthodox, but they really don't have the hashkafa. They don't have the worldview. And a rabbi knows his shul. And many rabbis in many shuls, you just don't talk about it. You just don't talk about that. If a Kohen would come to me with a divorcee and they love each other, I just can't marry with them. And nobody can. None of us can. You just don't talk about it because too many people can't handle it. But when it happens privately, you explain it. And I once had it happen. The guy quit the shul and joined the Reform Temple. And what are you going to do? What are you going to do? And doggone, he was one of my biggest donors. So I had a choice. Either I worship God or I worship money. So I chose God. And it was a thing. What could I do? You're not allowed. He left our shul and he went to another Orthodox shul. And I was curious. And by golly, the other Orthodox rabbi, in a very nice way, also told him he can't do it. And then he went to Chabad, because Chabad, the public, the marketing is, we accept everybody. We don't have any rules. We accept everybody. Chabad's Orthodox, or it's the closest thing to Orthodox. Chabad, no Chabad rabbi would do that either. And so even Chabad, the marketing is, come to us, we'll find a way. And you can't do it. So we joined the Reform Temple. They don't need the marketing. They just need to put the word reform. And that's all. It could be a mamzer, it could be a divorcee, it could be a non-Jew, anything. Just show us the money. So anyway, getting back here, a forbidden marriage does not get you off. It's still Jewish. The Kohen with the divorcee, it's still Jewish, but his children will be halal. Halal. They will become non-Kohens. Normally, the child of a Kohen father continues the legacy through the generations. But the child of a Kohen father who is in a forbidden Kohen marriage is a halal and is not a Kohen and cannot pass the kahuna on to future generations, is not given the first aliyah in shul, does not go up to bless the congregation. A halal is just, it is what it is. It's nebuch. So a widow betrothed to the high Kohen, a divorcee or yavama to a regular Kohen, a mamzeret or a givon, we won't go into that now because of time, who's betrothed to a Israelite, meaning a regular Jew, not a Kohen, not a Levi, or an Israelite woman. Regular Israelite means, Kohen, Levi, Israel. That's like priest, Levite, Israelite. So a non-Kohen woman betrothed to a mamzer. So whether it's a Jewish man to a female mamzer, or a female mamzer to or female kosher to a Jewish mom, to a male mamzer, any of those do not return home. Rabbi Yehuda says even one who rebuilds a house as it stood originally would not return. While we're on the subject of who doesn't go back, and we said that if you built a house, you go back in the first year, even if it's only a woodshed or a barn. He says, but if you rebuilt the house on the foundation, let's say, God forbid, the house got burnt down and you rebuilt it on its foundation, or you decided to upgrade your house, so you tore it down and then you built a better one. You don't go back. Rabbi Elazar says, if he builds a new brick house in the Sharon was a valley that had very loose soil with a predisposition to earthquakes. If you look very carefully, most of us don't notice it and miss it, but in the Ashkenazic Yom Kippur service, in the repetition of the Musaf Amida in the Ashkenazic Yom Kippur service, it talks about that the Kohen Gadol, after conducting the Yom Kippur Avodah in the Beit HaMikdash, then would go back, after the day was over, he'd go back home and he'd be accompanied by everybody. Those of you who were with us when we showed that video of what the Kohen does, and those of you who have heard the Yishai Ribo song of the Avodah, talk about how the Kohen goes, and everybody would be dancing and singing. And it's not in the song, and it's not exactly in the video we saw, but in the Machzor, in the prayer book, it lists like 22 different things that the Kohen would pray. It's why 22? Alphabetical. Follows an acrostic, each letter of the alphabet in order. And one of those was he'd pray for good economy and for good fruit and for peace. And one of the things was, and he would pray that for the coming year, all houses in the Sharon would not collapse. Like, what's that all about? Sharon is a region. Indeed, the famous former deceased Prime Minister Ariel Sharon, his family name was Scheinerman. It's a common thing for people with non-Jewish European names. When they moved to Israel, many would take on a Hebrew Israeli name. Golda Meyerson became Golda Meir. Yitzchak Rabinowitz became Yitzchak Rabin. Shimon Persky became Shimon Peres, and so on and so forth. They go with a whole long list. Ariel Scheinerman, the Scheinerman family lived in the Sharon area. They took on the name Sharon. So anyway, it's saying that a person who built a brand new house in the Sharon would not go back home, who's building it even though it's not up yet, or just built it. They would not say you're exempt and enjoy it for the first year, because odds are you're not, whatever Shlemiel reason you decided to build your house in the Sharon, you're probably not going to even end up enjoying it a whole year before it goes under or something. So he would not go back because the houses are not stable and are expected to collapse periodically. What kind of schmendrick builds a house where it is so probable that the house is going to collapse every year that he doesn't even get exempt from duty? It's but people are people. People are people who, why do people do things? Why did anybody, for those of you old enough to remember, why would anybody buy a Yugo? Remember that? Remember when Yugoslavia got the idea to sell their crack automobile in the United States, the Yugo? Remember that? That's going to compete with General Motors, Ford, Honda, right? Toyota, BMW, Mercedes, for those who would buy a German car, and a Yugo. Remember the Yugo? It lasted like 1 year. It was such a bad car. I remember they had all these Yugo jokes. How do you get a Yugo to go faster than 10 miles an hour? Push it over a cliff. Or that when you go and buy a Yugo, it's standard that they give you a contract, and they also give you a map to the New York City subway system, just so you can get from one place to the next. There are all these things about the Yugo. So why do people buy these things, do these things? Who knows why they do these things? But people do it, and you're not going to get an exemption from the army. Obviously, it would be the least expensive, and maybe they built like a hut. but he says brick. I don't know. Anyway, and now there's a third type. So we've talked about those who, when the shofars are blowing, the tekiah, and everybody's coming to assemble as an army, and the Kohen and the generals is making the speeches. We've talked about the ones that go back home, and we've talked about the ones that do not go back home but remain in the army. And the Gemara finally goes into people who don't even leave their house to join the assemblage to find out they can go back home. They so much go back home that they just stay home and they don't gather all together. Elu she'ein zazin mimkoman. Elu, these are she'ein, who don't. Zaz is to move. Those who do not move, mimakoman, me hamakom shalahen, from their place. First of all, let's look at an English for quicker. One who built a house and dedicated it within a year. One who planted a vineyard and used the fruit for less than, that is, he built it. And the question, how does that differ from a guy who built a house but didn't move in? So we said a guy who built a house but didn't move in goes to the army. You might think, well, he hasn't moved in yet, so let him fight. He's not going to die. Not everybody's going to die. A small percentage, God forbid, die. And he'll go and enjoy the house next year. But a guy who built it and already started enjoying it, we're not going to pull him out of the house in that first year. One who planted a vineyard and used its fruit for less than a year doesn't even go for the roll call. Same idea. You already see the nachas of your grapes growing. You're already enjoying it. We're not going to pull you away after 2 months. We want you to have a year with your grapes. One who marries is betrothed, and one who marries is Yavama. His brother's widow who must enter into a levirate marriage or perform chalitzas, etc., etc., etc. So these people stay. They don't leave the house. And that's that halacha. But those who exempt, for these reasons, do not even provide water and food. We learned last class that the others, the one who built a house and didn't move in, the one who planted a vineyard and didn't start grapes, the one who got engaged, betrothed but didn't marry, they go back home, but they help by providing supply lines of water, food, and paving roads. But someone who already is in the midst of enjoying his year, of his house, vineyard, and wife, does not even so much as assist with the providing of supplies, water and food and paving. And the idea is, what if he wants to volunteer? They tell him, we don't want you to volunteer. We're turning you away. We want you to stay with your wife for a year. We want you to stay with your grapes, and we want you to stay with your house. And we don't want you walking around with guilt. But we don't want you feeling an obligation. And we want it known very well by everyone else. We won't allow you in, so no one starts giving you a look like, oh, you had an exemption. Oh, so technically you were allowed. So we don't want anyone to even throw that at you. That the answer is, if you try to go, we're going to send you back because you're not allowed to be here. Now, this takes us into the last part of this Gemara, next week, God willing. Oh, next week is Thanksgiving. So, am I right? Yeah. Next Thursday's Thanksgiving, no class next Thursday. So we'll send out the announcements and we'll, God willing, meet the following Thursday. So we have class this Sunday, God willing, and this Tuesday, God willing, not Thursday of Thanksgiving. And we're also going to send out an email, not Sunday of Thanksgiving weekend. So we're going to take off Thanksgiving weekend. Just like the Gemara, you'll have an excuse. If someone says to you, why aren't you in Rabbi Fischer's shiur? And you'll say, well, it's Thanksgiving. That's no excuse. Rabbi Fischer won't let me attend. He killed the link for that day. So my service to you, reflecting the values of the Gemara. So we won't be meeting on Thursday and on the following Sunday, and then we'll be back again. Final word for those of you that might not be there Sunday is that Thanksgiving is celebrated by modern Orthodox Jews with a true sense of thanks. There's a big debate among Haredi Jews. Some of them take the modern Orthodox approach, which is really a Jewish approach. Modern, it's not even nice usually to divide different denominations. That's a Christian thing. They have lots of denominations. Like when people say, I'm a Reformed Jew, you're an Orthodox. No, I'm a Jew who is observant. You're a Jew who is not observant. I mean, there's no teams, Reform, Conservative. We're all Jews. Okay. Anyway, this great debate, Rav Moshe Feinstein was asked 1950s, are you allowed to celebrate Thanksgiving? We're not allowed to celebrate Christmas. That's not our holiday. God bless Christians who celebrate Christmas. They should. It's a shame on a Christian who doesn't celebrate Christmas. And they should celebrate Easter. That's their holiday. And it's for their religious beliefs. And Orthodox Jews are the biggest supporters of that. Let them have the mangers and those things and enjoy it. This country needs more religion. But Jews are not supposed to celebrate that. We celebrate Pesach and Hanukkah, Rosh Hashanah. So what about Thanksgiving? Because it's not a religious holiday. Or is it? The question went, because who are you Thanksgiving to? You're giving thanks to God. Is it religious? And Rav Moshe said that really, we all have a good reason as Jews in America to give thanks to God more than once a year, every day, for putting us in a country that's a haven for the Jewish people, certainly 1950s, and honestly, truly, it still is right now. Got to keep an eye on what's going on, but it still is. And they allow you to pray openly and have a shiur like this that goes on YouTube. They don't come and close down the shiur on grounds that it's Judaism, and they allow you to preach things I preach, and we can do everything publicly, and they support Israel with a lot of money, and they veto UN resolution, only 1 out of 15. Thank God. So we celebrate America very, very greatly. Then Rav Moshe got into a thing as to whether you should have turkey, because that maybe that's too much imitating the way the non-Jews celebrate. Maybe we should celebrate a different way, like with extra Torah learning or something. And that becomes a whole discussion unto itself. And it's, okay, I'm going on now. I can go on for an hour with this. But without getting into the why and wherefore, they even learned from that answer he gave in the 50s, that answered indirectly the question whether turkey is permitted to be eaten as a kosher meat. Until then, there was an ongoing question whether you're allowed to eat turkey. And it was in that question and answer, by virtue of his not answering, not commenting on turkey, it was understood that turkey is permitted. Until then, there were a great many kosher eaters who did not eat turkey, thinking it might be a forbidden bird. So anyway, we learned so much, and I wish you, look forward to seeing you Sunday. Happy Thanksgiving, and thanks so much for being here. Bye-bye.